should speak first. I mean, I'm easy. Sven was sort of first on the bill, so really he should go first. But if he's going to be late or if he doesn't want to go first, I can as well. I really don't mind.
Okay, fine. I think we'll just wait a few minutes if you don't mind, because we're just before the hour and people are like about joining these sorts of things. Is that okay? And then it'll give us a little chance for I'll just introduce us. So welcome everyone to this first of our events surrounding the COP27 on campus. So if you can look in the chat, you'll see there's a range of different activities and talks taking place. So please feel free to join any of them. Some of them will include pizza, but I won't specify which, so I'll just keep you on your toes. So I'm very pleased today to welcome our guest speakers. So we have Gareth Dale, who is a reader in political economy and has published extensively on many issues related to our topics today, including climate and environmental politics. He's a specialist in the work of Carl Polanyi, and he's also the Associate Head of Department for the Department of Social and Political Sciences. But our first speaker is Dr. Sven Fischer, who's an economist specializing in experimental and behavioral economics, and he's also widely published on these topics. So over to you, Sven.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. As a word of warning, yes, I'm not an environmental economist. And what I'm going to do here is trying to make a very superficial analysis of the situation from an economist, from a perspective of an economist who is not specialized in this area. Unfortunately, our department here at Brunel, we don't have an environmental economist. So I think I'm the third or fourth best alternative in the department to talk about this topic. So maybe as a brief introduction, so what's the problem? Well, we had, so there were supposedly supply chain problems following the COVID-19 pandemic, which already increased energy prices in general due to a reduction in general supply and deliveries. But then especially following the war the war in Ukraine and with Ukraine, there was a drastic reduction in the delivery of gas and oil coming from Russia to Europe. Partly also due to sanctions in response to the Ukrainian war. And this resulted in increase in prices for fossil fuels between 2 and 5 times the original prices, and also into a doubling in electricity prices. So this is here an example. I wasn't able to find similar nice diagrams for the UK. So this is from a perspective from Germany. It's all taken from one of the major newspaper publications in Germany, the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And on the left, you see the development of prices for petrol and diesel since January 2021. And on the right, you see it for household fuels. And here, especially, you see the explosion in prices following the invasion of Ukraine. But more interestingly, and this is what I'm going to look in primarily, is the development of electricity and prices for natural gas. So here prices are, in both cases, are expressed in a cent per kilowatt hour to make them comparable. In general, gas tends to be considerably cheaper per energy content than electricity. And here also you see basically how prices react to reductions in deliveries. On the 14th of June, Gazprom, the main exporter of Russian oil gas, reduced deliveries by 60%, and you can see the immediate spike in prices. Now, what was the effect of this? So this is gas usage in Germany as well, and the average temperature during the month. So for 2 years, it's for last year, 2021. So that's the pink color, and this year, 2022 in red. And you see the average daily consumption gas usage by households and industry. The light blue is previous year and the dark blue is this year. So the idea is you can hopefully see how much of a reduction in gas consumption was triggered by these increases in prices. And if you look at the diagram, it doesn't look as drastic as the increases in prices. So we have a really drastic increase in prices, a 5-fold increase in gas prices. So it now stands at 20 cents per kilowatt hour. At the beginning of the year, it was under 5 cents per kilowatt hour. So we have more than 4 times, at times more than 6 times the original prices. But you see that in October, partly, of course, because temperatures were higher, so there was less of a need to use gas for heating. But partly, of course, due to the price increases, we only see a reduction of roughly 25%. So huge increase in prices, relatively, well, comparably small reductions in consumption. Probably September is a better comparison because temperatures were more comparable to the previous year, and you see the differences here, less than 10 or 15%. So as economists, well, first of all, one question is, why did all fuel prices increase? So in the diagrams, you could see increases also in petrol and diesel. There wasn't as much of a reduction in petrol and oil deliveries as there was in gas. So, well, first of all, the rise in gas price increase, a rise in gas prices also increases the demand for substitutes, such as, for example, biogas, or to some extent oil, because there's to some degree there's some substitutability because both are sources of energy, and this substitutability then basically causes increases in demand for other fuels. So there's this indirect effect that if the price for one commodity increases due to substitutability, the demand, so if the price for one commodity increases due to substitutability, the demand for other commodities increases as well. Well, as a result, the demand for other commodities increases, and this then results in pressure on prices in these other markets. Then, of course, gas is an important input factor in the production, for example, of electricity. For example, if you produce electricity by gas, and therefore, if there's an increase in input factors, in this case of gas, then fewer firms are willing to produce at the existing prices. So prices need to increase in order for electricity being produced at a level where it can meet demand. So it's a standard market effect. Economists would basically just draw a simple diagram of demand and supply, and then argue that supply shifts inwards because there's a reduction in supply. So for every price, there's less electricity being produced because fewer firms are able to produce and make still a profit or basically meet their costs. So this is why there's a reduction in supply. And if there's a reduction in supply, there's going to be an increase in prices in order to find the new market equilibrium. And this is a standard thing we would expect, basically. But now, well, the main feature of gas is that demand for it is highly inelastic, which, if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, is a major problem. And this is what we basically see here. We see that a 5-fold increase in prices resulted in roughly a 20% decrease in consumption. And with these numbers, we would call this a price elasticity of demand of -1/20, which is really small. Okay. So despite a 5-fold increase in prices, there's only a 20% decrease in consumption. But overall, is it a good news now if we are concerned about greenhouse gas emissions that prices increase? And I was actually looking for an actual quote of one of the usual candidates, but in a short amount of time, I had to prepare these slides. I couldn't find one. So I've paraphrased from what you've probably heard in some talk shows on the TV or on the radio, suggesting that an increase in fuel and energy prices in order to reduce consumption is something environmentalists and environmental economists always wanted. So they should be happy. Now, the rhetorical question I'm asking, should we be happy? And well, first of all, I would first of all want to reply to this statement that no, that at least environmental economists never wanted this to happen. What environmental economists call for is that there should prices on greenhouse gas emissions, which is fundamentally different. So putting prices on greenhouse gas emissions might result in energy prices increasing, but that's not the intended outcome. So it's a consequence of what environmental economists would like to see. So what do we mean by that? So I'm going to basically talk about what economists would consider, I put it in quotation marks here, the gold standard in policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's a gold standard in an ideal world. In our abstract world, economists like to work in very simplified and abstract concepts. Unfortunately, these concepts often clash with reality. But let's suppose we live in a world which satisfies our simple models in economics. Then what the gold standard would be some form of emission certificate trade. What that means is, if you are an industry which emits greenhouse gases, in order to be allowed to emit these greenhouse gases, you have to buy a certificate. The total number of certificates in circulations are limited and ideally reduced on an annual basis. These certificates are traded on free exchanges. That's the general idea. Now, why is this considered the gold standard? Well, first of all, it's what we call it. The idea here is that the externality, the negative externality coming from emission of greenhouse gases is being internalized into the prices of production of consumer goods, of whatever, basically. The idea is basically whatever you're going to buy now has the price of the emissions internalized into it. So if you have two alternative products you can buy, and one resulted in a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, the other didn't, then there's going to be a price advantage, for a relative price advantage compared to where without any price on greenhouse gas emissions, there's clearly going to be a price advantage for the product which did produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, because it's expensive to avoid greenhouse gas emissions. So by putting a price on it, we create a balance in competitiveness, that production methods which try to avoid greenhouse gas emissions are not suffering the disadvantage anymore from being more expensive. The other idea is that, which is related to it, that it's going to improve the competitiveness of less harmful alternatives. So if we have different production methods, it increases the competitiveness of those production methods which reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The other incentive is that it's going to create monetary incentives for firms to reduce emissions and to invest into new technology. And economists tend to argue, and there's a lot of empirical evidence for this, a market-based approach in order to provide these incentives tends to be superior, because it tends to a more efficient allocation of money into new technologies and into research and development of methods in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And overall, the investment is supposed to be most efficient. That means the incentives with this mechanism, if essentially there's a price on greenhouse gas emissions, the incentives to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions are strongest for those for who's cheapest to do that. So if you have some industries where it is extremely expensive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it would be cheaper for you to buy the certificates on the free exchanges. Whereas if you work in an industry where it's relatively cheap to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because the technology is already available, and changing the production method doesn't cost a lot of money, then you would rather invest into reducing greenhouse gas emissions rather than buying the certificates. So the argument is with such a mechanism, the overall welfare costs the economies face from reducing greenhouse gas emissions is minimized. Okay, so this is the gold standard in quotation marks, because there are recent developments which highlight the problems which are associated with such an emission certificate trading mechanism. But I'm going to use this idea here these incentives I list here in order to analyze to what extent we should be happy about the current developments if we want a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and to what extent we should be concerned. And the very first effect which we are likely to observe as a response to these increases in prices is a substitution effect, which might be detrimental to when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this doesn't affect so the example I have here, for example, is that in some countries now, there's an increase in production of electricity using coal. This doesn't apply to the UK, so there's actually an interesting website I've linked here where you can, I'm unable to open it right now. Well, if you open this website, grid.imk.com, you can see the current energy mix in the UK. And there's hardly any coal production because there isn't much capacity left. But the diagram down here again is an example from Germany. And what you see, unfortunately, it starts in October, but if you would look further back. So the diagram essentially shows the entire production of electricity in megawatt hours on any given day. And it distinguishes in different types of production. So at the bottom down here, we have production of electricity using biomass. The one above is using hydropower. And then the yellow is nuclear power, and Germany has hardly any capacity to produce nuclear power left. And the brown now is coal, essentially. And what happened with gas prices increasing, coal took over a lot of the electricity production, which used to be made with gas. So the green is wind and solar energy, and you see at times actually it's more than 50% on some days. On good days, it can go up to 2/3 of the electricity mix. But what happened was basically that with the huge increases in gas prices, coal took over and replaced much of the electricity consumption, which was previously produced with gas, and gas tends to be considerably cleaner and produce less greenhouse gas emissions than coal. So that's the first effect which might happen, that actually due to substitution, we're going to see some increases in greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, that depends on the country. France, for example, 2/3, I think, are produced with nuclear power, so it doesn't apply to France, but it's likely to apply to other countries as well, who still have some capacity of electricity production using coal. And if you have, and the more you, that's now another problem, basically, the more you move towards renewable sources of energy, you face the problem of these huge fluctuations in the production, and basically to be able to satisfy a baseline demand even on bad days, usually energy markets need to have some alternative form of energy production, and unfortunately this still tends to be gas and coal, because these two can be powered up fairly quickly and basically can compensate days of low energy production with renewables. So that's the first effect which should concern us. The other effect which concerns us is that we've seen with these increases in gas prices, we might see an acceleration in the relocation of, I call it dirty industries here, meaning that industries which produce a lot of emissions, because of the increase in prices, there are now even stronger incentives to move this production from countries which have a lot of policies enforced which try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to countries which don't. For example, moving your car production from Germany to a country which still has a lot of electricity production using coal. And the problem with this relocation of entire industries is that it's, first of all, itself, it's a lengthy process, but the other problem is once it happened, it's very difficult to reverse, okay? So that's the other thing we should be concerned about. And finally, and thirdly, the other thing we should be concerned about, if we are concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, of course, is that with this increase in fossil fuel prices on the international exchanges, there are now increased incentives of exploitation of resources of these fossil fuels. Why is that a problem? Well, these exploration and the basically creating the infrastructure of exploiting these oil fields and gas fields are sunk costs. What that means is, first of all, it works as a kind of barrier to do these kinds of exploitations, because you need to invest a lot at the beginning in order to be able to exploit gas reserves, for example. But the problem is, once you have made this investment, and basically if you now expect prices to go up, if you expect that prices continue to be high, there is an increased incentive to make this upfront investment, because it becomes a economically profitable endeavor to do so. So if you think prices are going to remain high, it's going to be profitable now to invest into, for example, fracking, which tends to be one of the more expensive forms of gas exploitation, gas production. Now, the problem is, once you've made that investment into creating this infrastructure, it was a sunk cost. It doesn't affect your continuing production. Because it's a sunk cost, you've paid for it, the money is gone. Now every cubic meter you're going to produce is going to be cheap. Once you have started exploiting, once you have invested in the infrastructure, the so-called marginal costs, the cost of producing an additional unit of additional cubic meter of gas is pretty low. Now, for fracking, for example, it tends to be more expensive than for other methods. But the general problem is, once this investment was made, there's the incentive to try to exploit the gas field, the oil field, up until it's finished, pretty much. Okay, and even strong movements in gas prices might not change this incentive a lot. So this is basically the other thing we should be concerned about. So, and lastly, and this is hopefully leading to what Gareth is going to talk about, there's a political economy perspective to it. What the current developments have highlighted to everyone is how much our wealth depends on cheap sources of energy. And this might not have been something which the majority of the population was so aware of, but with the current events, many will be now aware of this fact. And this might create a reluctance among politicians and amongst the electorate in general to pay for continuing reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So that's this very first aspect to it. And then there's another aspect, which is basically the consequences from policy interventions into the current developments. I just give one example. I'm just going to give one example, but we can kind of discuss other ones as well. So a very dominant and common response to the explosion in gas prices is, or in energy prices in general, is a policy of creating some price caps for consumers and for households and for industry. Now, let's limit our attention to households. Now, this, of course, first of all, offsets the entire price mechanism. So initially we said, it's good that fossil fuels have become more expensive because it's going to reduce consumption. Good thing, reduces carbon emission. But the problem now is that if now policy intervenes and says we have a price cap, this price mechanism is kind of destroyed, okay? So it's partly offset. That's the first effect. Now, there's also a fairness component, because introducing a price cap for everyone is going to mean basically that there's going to be more tax subsidies into energy consumption to those who have high levels of consumption. So basically, someone who has a 5-bedroom house and heats all his rooms is going to get more of a tax subsidy for his energy consumption than the one bedroom apartment, universal credit household, who has a much lower overall consumption. So that's the first, fairness aspect to this. But in the long run, you could argue that this actually creates a moral hazard, because let's give an example. Suppose you have two twins, both bought the same type of property. One invested 50,000 into a state-of-the-art heating system and invested into isolating his house. The other invested his money into a swimming pool and an expensive sports car. So now basically the guy who invested his money into a swimming pool is going to get a lot of subsidies from the government to continue heating his swimming pool and to continue driving his fuel inefficient car, versus the guy who invested into saving energy essentially is now cross-subsidizing his twin brother. Why is this calling? We call this, but it's not exactly moral hazard, but basically what does that mean in the future? That means in the future you're stupid to invest into reducing your consumption of energy, because you know, if, excuse my French, shit hits the fan, the government is going to intervene and make sure that I can continue with my level of energy consumption. So this is what I mean roughly here by detrimental long-term effects by poorly designed government interventions into this energy crisis. And yeah, I want to hand over to you, Gareth.
Thanks so much, Sven, for kicking off the discussion in such an interesting way. I'm just going to try and screen share. How do I do that again? Okay. All right, is that working?
Yes, it is.
It is working. Excellent. All right. Yeah. So thanks, Sven, for beginning the conversation, and thank you to Mary and to the Global Challenges staff and students for inviting me along and to this event, and excuse me, sorry, and for putting together such an interesting series of events, as you seem to do every year around the time of COP. Because COP was the sort of hook for your series of events, I'm going to shift the thematic a little bit more, well, quite a bit more, towards the relationship between energy and climate change. Then I'll say a few words about COP itself, briefly make a little point about economics, and then finally I'll look at the question that you've given us to begin a conversation around the effect of the energy crisis on carbon reduction. So 4 general areas that I'm going to look at one by one, starting to put things in perspective, starting with climate change itself because of the COP relationship. I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly because I've shown some of these graphs to my students, and I know some of them are here. I don't want to cover too much ground twice. But this is a graph that reconstructs average global temperature and carbon dioxide levels over a very long period of time. And what you see in this graph is that here on the bottom right, there's this era of about 12,000 years of gorgeous stability. It's known as the Holocene. It's a beautiful era. Why? Because the climate was stable, incredibly stable, as you can see. And it was absolutely benign for enabling humans to thrive and flourish. It was a uniquely hospitable period for human life. It lasted, as I said, around 12,000 years. And all the documents of literature and virtually all art that you have ever seen, give or take a few cave paintings, all of these are from this period. All so-called civilization emerged in this period, and these works of literature, etc., were produced by those lucky 400, 430 generations of human beings who lived during this beautiful time before our generation came along and murdered it. To see how we killed the Holocene, you need to notice that these graphs only go up to 1950, and after 1950, the line of carbon dioxide soars as human beings used more and more coal and oil and gas to fuel our cars and our planes and our industries. I prepared this this slide for a talk I gave several years ago to environmental scientists in Shanghai, and I can't remember how many years ago. Back then the figure for atmospheric CO2 was 400. Now it is much higher than that. Already it's around 420, I think. This 420 is higher than it's been at any time in the last 14 million years. So just to give you a sense of perspective on that, the last time CO2 levels were this high, our branch of primates, the great apes, were only just beginning to speciate. And we had only, we being the great apes, we had only recently diverged from the ancestors of these cutie darlings you can see on the screen, who, by the way, we're about to drive to extinction. These two here, there's only 26 others of them, and they're soon going to be gone, like so many species that we're wiping out. So we've left the Holocene behind, and unless really radical action is taken, we are now heading rapidly to a hothouse Earth, a turbulent, hot climate with terrible problems of water, too much in some places and far too little in others. Now, predictions of climate modelers, they generally give us a range of different scenarios to look at, but the reality as it has unfolded has tended to track closer to those upper limits. And in recent years, in the last couple of years in particular, most climate scientists have been quite aghast at what we've been seeing, at how dramatically records have been shattered. This is probably because feedbacks are developing faster than were ever envisaged. And as we get closer to 1.5 above the pre-industrial average, we're increasingly risking triggering more and more climate tipping points that could lead to further abrupt climate change, abrupt, irreversible global heating. Already in the last 20 years, as I said, we've seen many of the worst case predictions being exceeded. Now, what are the predictions for 2100? That's 78 years away, quite a long time away in human life terms. It's not next year or the year after, 78 years away, but you know, some of you in the audience may live long enough to see it. So it's worth talking about, I think. Well, the standard predictions for 2100 talk about around 2.7 Celsius or 3 Celsius. But on the upper end of the predictions, scientists are talking of 4 degrees as a possibility. And given that we've been tending to track the worst case scenarios, that has to be seen as a possibility. And the really troubling thing for me, I think, is that one of the many, is that at 4 degrees, according to a recent study by scientists at Caltech, there is a serious risk that we would trigger cloud loss on such a scale that the temperature then jumps by an additional 8 degrees. So that's 12 degrees in all. And with 12 degrees, what are you talking about? You're talking about not just, this is the article I referred to. At 12 degrees, you're talking not just a bit of sea level rise, you're talking certainly sea level rise as far as Uxbridge and quite a bit higher as well. And you'd be saying goodbye to most species on Earth, including our own. We would be toast at 12 degrees. To put 12 degrees in perspective, we're currently only 4 degrees warmer than we were at the depth of the last ice age, when a vast ice sheet covered the whole of Northern Europe, including all of Britain. And right now we're about 1.2 above the pre-industrial average, and we just have to avoid hitting 1.5, and 2, even hitting 2 would be even more catastrophic. So that's the scale of the problem that we face. An organization that is deemed to be the one to oversee and coordinate action is the COP. What is the COP doing to address this challenge? The COP, many of you are probably aware, it's meeting this year in the sort of pseudo-Egyptian town of Sharm el-Sheikh. And the COP meets every year, and if there is one graph that summarizes the plight of humanity and all other species on this earth, it's this one. This graph plots the annual meetings of the COP. It plots them against the rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And what you notice from this graph is that after the COP meetings begin, the CO2 emissions don't just carry on rising, they actually start to rise a bit faster. So you have to think about this. Well, you might protest, do not confuse correlation with causation. You would have a point. But I'm going to suggest to you that it's more than simply correlation. The COP is the world's organizing center for climate denial. It is more powerful by far and more effective than Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and the rest of them. If they might be, you might see them as evil in a sort of Bond villain kind of way. If so, then COP is evil in the banal way, the Arendtian way. Of course, there are exceptions. I acknowledge that very, very quickly. Noble exceptions. Antonio Guterres, top dog of the United Nations, makes absolutely fantastic speeches at COP. He gets the issue. So too do many representatives from the global south. I mean, each year there are many of them stand up and make magnificent, urgent speeches. This year we've heard, for example, from Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. But basically, the COP is run by the rich countries, and it is infested with lobbyists from the oil and gas industries, hundreds of them. And they pretty much set the agenda along with the oil states. That is why you find, this is astonishing, you find no mention of coal or oil or gas in any final text. So the official agreement from COP. Not for 30 years. From Rio all the way through to Glasgow last year, no mention. At Glasgow, there was a partial mention of one of those fossil fuels, coal, but it was a mention so pathetic, so feeble, so deliberately open to any interpretation that it was a joke, and the coal companies were laughing all the way to the bank. But there was no mention at COP of oil or gas, and never has been at COP. I mean, that's what I mean when I say COP is the central hub organizing climate denial on the world stage. Just in case that's too abrupt for you, I mean, look, let's just remind ourselves, fossil fuel companies, whether they're privately owned or state-owned, they are overwhelmingly the main cause of global heating. Over the last 10 years, they've been responsible for nearly 90% of carbon dioxide emissions. So compare COP, let's draw an analogy. Imagine you have lung cancer and you go to the doctors. You go to the doctors every year for 30 years. Every year, she sounds very concerned about your health. I mean, your doctor, she's not a cancer denialist in the usual sense, but she refuses to do anything about your cigarette addiction. She won't even talk about your cigarette addiction. Instead, she gives you a torrent of advice on, you should go swimming, you should drink turmeric tea, you should have a good night's sleep, etc. All of these things are lovely things, they're good things, but none of them address your cancer. And then you go and do a little bit of research on your doctor and you find out that she used to work for a tobacco company and they are still paying her a stipend. That's what COP is. And sorry, Greta is being a bit too nice when she focuses on the blah, blah, blah of COP, although she does know the real reality is much darker than that, and she does talk about this as well, which is the corruption. I don't want to imply that corruption is the core of the problem, however. A lot of politicians and the oil industry, they do share a bed, which is unseemly to behold. And that does matter. It does have meaningful consequences, but I don't think it's the heart of the problem. You get a little closer to the heart of the problem when you look at ideology, in particular, the ideology that is known more decorously as economics. Scientific economics, I'm just going to be very brief on this, but I'm happy to converse about it later if you like. Scientific economics, what do I mean by that? It's a discipline that the foundation stones for it were laid in England and France in the 17th and early 18th centuries by these 6 chaps, my favorite of whom is Barbon on the top right, because he, you got to give it to his parents. He's the economist with the most memorable name, and also the economist with the name that is most difficult to remember. Now, these early economists, they didn't establish the discipline of economics as in its final form by any means, but they laid the foundation stones for it. In an incredibly ideological way. They laid the foundation of economics on a very ideological basis. Economics was not going to be about the ways in which human societies convert natural substances into livelihoods to enable their lives to carry on. It was not going to be about the distribution or the maldistribution of prosperity of resources among citizens. Instead, it was going to be a mathematical discipline concerned very narrowly with the dance of prices around equilibrium positions. And as a discipline, it has always and ever since upheld a very distinctive ideology. And this is the ideology that came to govern the modern world. And the ideology is, if you own property, if you own money, you must try to expand it. And everything that you as a property owner find in nature is basically a free gift to capital, to you. It's there to help you make a profit. Now, as the centuries rolled on, the natural world was increasingly expelled from economics, particularly in the 19th century during the neoclassical revolution. It's the neoclassical brand of economics, a kind of pseudoscience really, that continues to dominate the discipline today. And the result of this is that we now find ourselves here, really. The price of gas, as this cartoon, I think, brilliantly conveys, is these things. The price of gas, the high price of gas, is the destruction of the planet. But economics has always been unable to get to grips with ecological collapse or even to recognize it, because the only prices that it is programmed to see are market prices and not the real world consequences of its own liberal market ideology. And by market ideology, I mean the idea, as I mentioned before, that if you have money and property, you have to expand it and the natural world can go to hell. Now, some people are protesting about this and have been this week, and kudos to them. Kudos to the Just Stop Oil group, and especially to the Dutch group, who a few days ago broke into Schiphol airport, and they occupied the area specifically for private jets. I think that's important to draw our attention to, because what they were doing was, pointing out that by far the worst climate criminals are the rich. They're the people in the rich countries, and above all, they're the rich within the rich countries. There've been some recent pieces on this, one on here in The Guardian and here in the Financial Times, drawing on recent reports from the United Nations and from Oxfam, which basically show that the climate crisis is driven by, well, the rich countries and the rich within the rich countries. Now, I mentioned the Just Stop Oil protesters. And they've been quite controversial because some people object to their tactics, and understandably. If you don't like their tactics, I think it's worth bearing this in mind. They are the tactics of a desperate minority. If the rest of us join in and build a mass movement, that sort of desperate tactic no longer becomes seen as necessary. So onlookers who get annoyed at those groups' desperate activity should realize that it is the pendant, it is the mirror to our own inactivity. So, or to put it differently, the answer is not to arrest the minority, it's to arouse the majority on this issue in general. Political action is required to confront the energy crisis that Sven was talking about, and the environmental crisis that I'm focusing on. And we cannot place hopes in economic trends to come and rescue either situation. I recall about 7 years ago, oil and gas prices fell through the floor. And some environmentalists back then were hoping that this would kill off the fracking industry. Because as Sven mentioned, fracking is quite an expensive form, generally speaking, of extracting hydrocarbons from under the earth. And so there's, high costs involved. And when the price plummets, as it did 7 years ago, many firms can be put out of business. And some environmentalists hoped that this economic trend of falling gas and oil prices would see off at least the frackers. Didn't happen. Last year, we saw the opposite. As you've seen on Sven's graphs as well, back in 2021, the gas price soared. And then this year, they rose further when Russia invaded Ukraine. And some environmentalists have been saying, this is going to accelerate the transition to renewables because renewables are getting cheaper relative to gas and oil every day. But that is naive. And it's naive for reasons that Sven spelt out very, very clearly, I think. And I think it was his slide 12 thereabouts, because the price now is so high that profits are extremely high as well. And this makes corporations greedy for more. Drill, baby, drill is the motto of the corporations and the governments. In America, Joe Biden has switched from being sort of ambivalent on these questions on fossil fuel exploration and expansion to being gung-ho, urging producers to drill, frack, frack. In Britain, our government has issued over 100 new licenses to drill for oil. There has been a massive uptick in coal use in India and in Germany. There are new gas projects right across Africa. I'm not suggesting Africa should be the place to begin this problem with, because because of reasons of climate justice, but where it's just another example. There's more oil drilling, more fracking all around the world. And that, as Sven said, I'm just echoing his argument here, really. This means there are huge investments in infrastructure going on, and the owners will fight tooth and nail to defend those assets and therefore to slow down the decarbonisation agenda, because their investments are going to lock in massive rises in emissions for years to come. So we've been seeing enormous expansion of oil pipelines. We've been seeing pro-oil voices, you can see in the Financial Times article here on the right, are suddenly getting much bolder. They get bolder as the price gets higher because they can see more profits coming in. And there's therefore more lobbying of governments for more subsidies. Now, what's going to happen next? Well, probably, at least in Britain, some other parts of the world too, I would imagine, there's going to be a recession that will squeeze demand. And then also we're seeing a huge investments in new oil and gas, as I mentioned earlier. And those, once they start coming on stream, oil and gas will become a bit more affordable again, but only until the next price spike, and so on, and the infernal cycle continues. And throughout this process that we're seeing now, trillions of dollars are gushing into the oil industrial wallets and coffers, and some of that is going to be earmarked for waging an ideas war against environmentalism. Some of it is going to be used for buying off politicians, for swaying policies, and this is therefore going to ensure the continuation of this absolutely genocidal trajectory that we are on as a human species on this planet that hitherto has treated us so well, and we're now destroying. And this catastrophic trajectory is going to continue unless and until people say enough is enough and rebellions break out to stop it. So on that note, I'll leave it there and move on to discussion.
Thank you so much, Gareth. That was excellent, and it was great to just sort of segue the two talks together there towards the end, drawing out some of the sort of shared themes you were discussing there. I'd like to open it up to the floor, but before that, I wondered if you, either of you, would like to say a little bit perhaps about, you know, we try to, on the Global Challenge Programme, we certainly try to look towards, you know, ways forward, because we, you know, obviously the picture is very bleak, and as Gareth has quite rightly said, you know, COP happens every year, and it's now 27 years, and what results have we seen? In terms of ways forward, you know, there's lots of talk about, you know, you've spoken about the certificates for emissions, but what about carbon taxes? What's your view on the use of carbon taxes as a mechanism to try and curb some of the excesses that we're seeing?
Sorry, are you addressing me or Sven? Sven, you should. Your turn. You know, I mean, I'll say a few words on carbon tax, but I think it's best for you to kick off. It's more in your field than in mine.
Maybe let me just go back to your presentation, Gareth. Just three brief replies. So you mentioned that correlation is not necessarily causation. There's of course another problem with this diagram, which is that with population growth and with economic growth, one would expect that without any interventions, it should be an exponential graph, and it looks a bit more like a linear graph. So from this perspective, I would argue that it reflects by far not enough, but it reflects some form of successful reduction in emissions. Not to the extent that it actually reduces overall the concentration in the atmosphere, but it, compared to where we would be without any interventions, it had some success. So I think that's what the diagram, that's how I would interpret the diagram as an economist. When it comes to the argument that economics is a strongly ideology-driven pseudoscience, I agree with the science thing because it never was a science. There have been attempts since the last 20 years to make it more similar, to use methods borrowed from science in economics. Suggesting that the idea that the natural world is for grabs is a core element of the field, I think is doing it a bit of injustice. I think this has been more a reflection of the dominant beliefs and ideologies at the time. And the general idea, I think, has been a core element, not just of economics, but of other attempts of organizing or analyzing a social and economic interaction. So this has not, I think the idea of environmentalism became more dominant later. So I think you're doing a bit injustice here, suggesting it has always been a core element. And clearly it's not that economics as a field has never thought and analyzed these problems. So there's a lot of research on the common pool resource problem. cooperation, the idea that people actually can cooperate. And so I see your point being a behavioral economist. The field has often been very narrow-minded, and especially when it comes to, well, there's always been a distinction between the research which is being done and the way it's being communicated and used for politics. And the way it's being communicated and used for politics quite often has been dominated by a very narrow understanding of economics in general. And basically with a focus on the benefits a society, an economy can reap from growth and markets, and ignoring benefits from cooperation and other forms of social interaction, and benefits which are not which cannot be expressed in monetary terms. So just a very, I just wanted to defend my field at least a bit here. Okay, Mary, concerning taxation. So carbon taxation, and the same with the carbon emission. I mean, it suffers from one main problem, which is the coordination problem amongst all countries in the world. So especially climate skeptics, people who are skeptic of climate change, they often come with this argument, yeah, but the emissions in the UK are just 2% of all emissions in the world, so why should we do something about this? This is the general problem of a coordination failure. If everyone makes this argument, then no one is going to do anything about it. And this result remains. So if there's no way of coordinating this, and if there's no way of cooperating on greenhouse gas reduction of greenhouse gas emissions on a global scale, then such a taxation system is equally going to be doomed to failure, such as the emission certificate approach. My understanding from the research is that a taxation approach is actually these days considered to be the more practical and more promising approach than using a certificate trading approach, partly due to the questions of enforcement. But again, I'm not an expert on that. So yeah, taxation would basically, it's the second favorite. So from theorists, it's the second favorite approach after the idea of emission certificate market.
Thank you, that's really helpful. So I was going to then leave it open to the floor to see if there's any questions being posted there, or students or other people here in the session want to put their hand up to ask a question to either Sven or Gareth about what they've been talking about. Ella.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. That was amazing. It was good, very informative, back to back, worked nicely. And yeah, I was just wondering about, I recently heard that governments were regulating renewables for their capacity to like companies that are creating renewable energy sources. I heard that there's a new regulation that basically tries to prevent renewable industries from reinvesting back in renewables. And I wondered if you guys had heard anything about that.
I'm afraid I haven't heard about this. I don't know. There has been a problem with some producers of renewable electricity because they have long-running subsidy contracts, kind of, where basically they have a guaranteed price they receive for every kilowatt hour they deliver to the network. So for them, basically, it means at the moment they don't benefit from the high energy prices because they are forced to sell it for cheap because they are bound by these contracts. So I don't know whether this is what this relates to, but this is basically meaning that there are some unfortunate offshore wind parks, I think, and some solar parks, which are at the moment unable to profit from these huge increases in electricity prices.
Interesting, thank you.
Okay, I'll say just a brief comment on this. On Ella's question, I'm afraid, like Sven, I don't know the answer to that. It's not something I have heard about. I would just draw your attention to a general problem with renewables in a market system, which is the more investment in renewables, the more the price goes down. But that you would think is a wonderful solution, putting the Earth on a trajectory to more and more cheap renewables. But in a market system, it's actually perversely enough a problem, because the more that gets invested, the cheaper the output of electricity, and nobody wants to invest in it any longer because the returns will be limited. That's why it's imperative that you have very forceful state action or some sort of political action anyway to overcome that problem. But it is a huge problem, as I think if I'm successfully screen sharing, you should be able to read a quote from The Economist magazine on that. I'll just come to a few other points that were raised. A couple of points that to continue the conversation with Sven, I'll make a couple of points and then to briefly talk about taxation. So Sven, on population, Sven looked at my graph of the COP meetings and the atmospheric CO2 rising and said, well, look, the graph does reflect some form of successful reduction in emissions. Compare it to where we'd be without any interventions, because you have to bear in mind population growth and economic growth. Well, my response to that would be, on population growth, most people born into this world have very little money and create very low emissions. Population growth isn't really the problem. Economic growth much more is, because that involves, economic growth involves more and more resource use. There are idle hopes of decoupling of GDP growth and resources, but there's no actual evidence that it's possible, and it certainly is not possible on anything like the scale that we require. I just think Sven is defending the COP a little too much here, saying, and well, not just the COP, but the COP standing for all groups of powerful people posturing as if they're making serious changes, when I would argue they're not. Sven says, compared to where, the graph reflects some form of successful reduction in emissions. No, it doesn't. But we're absolutely murdering the planet. We're beginning a mass extinction of species. We are creating conditions for nonlinear climate change, cascading tipping points, an absolute decimation of the Earth system, rendering it uninhabitable for billions of people. You can't talk about successful reduction in emissions when the line is continuing to go up in this case. It's not just CO2, it's methane as well, but thanks to all sorts of things, feedback issues, as well as incredible amounts of methane released by the oil and gas companies. So in that context, I just don't think we can talk about successful reduction in emissions in any form, however hedged and qualified. On the question of economics, I'm not going to take up any real time on this, because this is something I've done a great deal of research in, and Sven and I could have long conversations about this into the night, but I don't think it would be of that great an interest to the audience. But I would just say that that economists themselves, I think this is as an economist, this is the appropriate approach to take, is the one that was taken by economists Andrew Oswald and Nicholas Stern a few years ago, when they said, look, in neglecting climate breakdown, economists have failed the world, including their own grandchildren and their great great-grandchildren. Humans of the future, they write, are going to judge our profession harshly. And I think they're absolutely right to do so. Look, they looked around all the top journals of economists, and there's nothing on climate change. Economics as a discipline, even recently, you know, I think Robert Solow, for example, have said, you know, we don't need to bother about the exhaustion of natural resources, because the magic of the market is that if you use up all of one resource, someone will come up with another one and substitute for it. And this has been the dominant attitude within the economics profession. I'm not saying that that's Sven's attitude at all, but within this discipline, within this profession, this has been the dominant attitude, and I think we should recognize it as a real problem and a contributor to the cataclysmic mess that we find ourselves in. On taxation, problem with taxation is it can be carbon taxes can be regressive. I mean, put a massive tax on flights, and that will be a progressive tax, because most people who fly are business people and rich people. Working people don't fly much, and people in poor countries hardly fly at all. So it's largely a progressive tax. But slap a big tax on heating your home, and it becomes more of a regressive tax. And so I think taxation has to be taxation for environmental grounds have to be approached quite carefully for that reason. Look at the Gilets jaunes protests in France a few years ago. You know, that was partly, those protests rose partly in response to taxes that were framed as environmental taxes. If you're going to put taxes on, say, car use, you need at the same time to be improving public transport access so that people have alternatives. Sven talked about the price inelasticity of fossil fuels in many situations, in many goods, and that is a real problem. So if you're going to tax them, you should, I think you should, but you also need to be providing alternatives. And I think we need to be rationing and banning much more than we've been doing as well. I think, you know, there's a very good study by the FIRES group of engineers and scientists at Cambridge University, led by, I forget his name, but they've published really the gold standard on the decarbonisation agenda in Britain. If we want to reach net zero by 2050 in Britain, they write in their report, we need to close down all airports in Britain, apart from Heathrow and Glasgow, by 2030. That's within the next 7 years. That's if we're going to reach net zero by 2050. Sorry, Julian Allwood is the name. And so we just need to, you know, radically start shutting stuff down, because that's going to be one of the key ways of switching off the spigot, the oil spigot. If we take the planet and future life on it seriously, I suppose has to be the qualifier, but I'm hoping that we will.
Thank you, Gareth. I didn't know whether Sven wanted to respond to anything that Gareth said there, or whether we wanted to shift it, because there's a few questions in the chat. So, for instance, Nafisa says to Sven, when you say a country has no capacity left, do you mean that specific resource has been used up? If they could, would they use that resource?
I'm trying to understand what it refers to. In which context did I say that there's no capacity left?
Yeah, so perhaps Nafisa is there. Perhaps if you're able to come on.
Oh, I think I know what it refers to. The problem with renewable resources that they are subject to a lot of fluctuations in supply. So I think that refers to.
Yes, that's right. If you can,
so I think it refers to this diagram I showed here. Yeah, so the argument is renewables. So you see here so this green bar and the light green bar above is wind and solar, and you see that there are huge fluctuations in how much they're able to produce on a daily basis. And for this, well, this is a major problem for switching to renewables in the electricity production. So biomass allows a very constant production, and hydropower does, but all the other renewables, they are subject to huge fluctuations in supply and demand. Well, basically, if you want to have a reliable network which is able to supply, then either you have to have a lot of excess capacity in wind and solar, or you basically need to have some form of electricity production which can kick in on days where there is hardly any production by these renewables. There had been a lot of talking in the past, basically, that you need to invest into a wider network, so that if there's wind in one end of the country but not in the other, that then basically the excess produced in one end is more efficiently delivered to other parts of the country. But these investments are being made, but these are all very expensive. And also very controversial, because people don't want to have these power lines running through their country. And the other solution is basically some kind of storage, electricity storage, that you, on days of excessive, where you, like here, where more than 50, almost 60% of the electricity produced comes from renewables, you put this into some kind of storage, which you then take out on days when there isn't. But these storages, I mean, the most efficient which exist are essentially storages where you pump water up a hill into a reservoir, and then once there's need, you allow the water to run down through some turbines to produce electricity. But these are also very expensive, and to build them also you need to use a lot of concrete, which again creates a lot of CO2 emissions. Despite of lots of money being invested in this, little has happened over the last 15 years. Which is why Germany basically had to switch on some coal plants again, such as there's a comment by Iana, who asked whether this was Lana, sorry, Lana, which asked whether this was inevitable. Well, inevitable. Nothing is inevitable. You could introduce rationing. So it's essentially, if you want the economy to work, continue to work, and well, I suggest that's in the democracy, which majority of the population at the moment still has the preference for working economy over climate change, I'm afraid. So if you want to do that, then, and you don't want to take drastic measures such as rationing, then I guess this was the only solution Germany could follow up on. I mean, the other solution they did is after a lot of, I mean, for those who don't know, there's the Green Party is part of the governing coalition in Germany at the moment, and they are very reluctant to extend the allowed running time of nuclear electricity, of the nuclear power plants, and they now agreed to that as well. So there are 3 nuclear power plants left in Germany, which were supposed to be switched off at the end of the year, and there has been now some kind of allowance to extend this to mid next year, which probably not going to make much of a difference, but that's the situation in Germany.
Thanks, Sven. There is another question about taxation ending up being passed on to consumers, and I guess that's probably inevitable. But is there another mechanism by which carbon taxes on carbon emissions could be filtered in a different sort of way? I know Guy Standing was talking about using that as a resource for universal basic income. I know it's not directly related to the climate, but I guess the climate impacts as they disadvantage the poorest within society was a sort of another tool that could be seen in a positive light in relation to this.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk of taxing the fossil fuel industry and using the the proceeds of this taxation for all kinds of policy interventions. The problem with that is any taxation, and it doesn't matter whether you ask the consumer to pay the tax or the seller, to what extent each side of the market shares the burden of the tax depends on this elasticity of demand. And because demand for gas is highly inelastic, most of the burden of this tax will be carried over to the consumer. So yeah, the taxation, of course, will be able to create revenue, but the main party which will have to pay this is going to be the consumer. So essentially, if there's I gave the example. I discussed the problem with the price cap, but it essentially results in high emitters receiving a high subsidy for consuming electricity. I think actually the best approach is essentially to introduce lump sum payments to households which really suffer from the energy crisis. Basically making lump sum transfers to every household, which guarantees that you can heat at least one room and have a shower every second day. So that would, of course, would need to depend on the number of people who live in the household. But this would be, first of all, fairer. It wouldn't undermine the price mechanism, because every individual household would still have an incentive to limit its consumption of gas as much as possible, because the more you reduce your consumption, the more money you're going to save. But it will basically guarantee that everyone at least is able to have a minimum standard of living.
But I suppose that doesn't very address the environmental, you know, in terms of
no, that's just basic. Yeah, no, it doesn't. No.
There's a comment here from Nadaraja, who says fossil fuel is still effective and economical means of producing energy. It will be the case for another 100 years. So new technology is required to make the emission zero for fossil fuel. Yes, renewables should be continuously researched, developed and implemented, but we aren't going to fulfill our energy requirements with renewables in the near future. Just wondered, perhaps Gareth would like to respond to that.
Right. I was actually diverted thinking about other questions, such as, well, I noticed there's one hand up in the audience, for example, and also I was thinking of Lana's question about Germany. You know, do you think it was inevitably necessary to reactivate the old coal power stations? No, absolutely, it wasn't necessary. You know, I recently wrote a biography of somebody who was born in the 1860s. He was a political economist and anthropologist. Mary mentioned him at the beginning. And what was interesting about writing the biography of somebody who was alive in the 1890s and 1910s is it reminded you that you can have a very, very happy and healthy life in a world where we don't use oil and where our emissions are very, very low, and just the general products that we churn out and are far, far fewer. You can have a happy and healthy, I feel, I mean, it should be an obvious point, but I feel like I need to insist on it because people aren't getting it. People assume, and this is the market ideology that has infected all our minds, they assume that if it's a choice between saving the planet and saving our current economic system, I think as Sven argued recently, then, you know, fuck the planet, because people aren't going to vote for any change to their circumstances. Destroy the planet because people cannot imagine any other kind of world. Well, I would say to that, no, we have to break out of that form of that style of thought and say, no, okay, let's just, all right, if we can't open up the coal power stations, let's just do things in very different ways. When I was a teenager, I used to get trains around Europe. It was before cheap flights. I had a very happy teenage years. We can be happy people without flying around all the time. We can build night trains. If we need to go on holidays, and we do. I'm not a Puritan. I'm not a hair shirt type. We need holidays by the beaches. Look, you can put on it doesn't even need to be an ultra high speed train, just a fairly fast train. Well, if you put on overnight trains, you can go to sleep in London and wake up in Barcelona, go to the beach, have breakfast there, have a holiday. You don't need to fly. You can set up alternatives for all these things. We should be taking the climate crisis incredibly seriously, and human beings can be imaginative when they face a crisis and when they face it together. And that sense of being together is as much for together in the face of a crisis is one of the key arguments, sort of subliminal arguments, if you like, for the need to build social movements on this issue, which I alluded to earlier on, because it's when you sense that you are involved with other people in a collective project in face of a crisis that incredibly imaginative things can be done, and people will be prepared to make sacrifices. Academics, I get invited. I get invited to go and speak around Europe all the time, and you get invited one year to Budapest, and the next year to Bucharest, and the next year to Prague, and you get a flight each time because you're not allowed enough time off work to go there. Academics should be demanding we completely restructure this form of doing our research trips. Instead of flying off each year to one of those places, you just save them up every 5 years and then to do a long train journey and make sure your university gives you that extra time off that you need to do that. You go by train, you group them together and so on. It's just what I'm just giving you an example of one simple way in which life can be reorganized to use vastly less fossil fuels. Insulate people's homes. Okay, maybe raise some carbon taxes and so on, and so people need to pay more. But at the same time, you, as a government, you back the installation of people's homes across the board, and that saves enormous amounts and increasing amounts of money, given the degree to which Britain's homes are leaky, and given the price of heating our homes right now. That hasn't been done. It's been shocking. I'm not making a party political point. The Labour Party, the last Labour government, was in power from 1997 to 2010. At the end of their time in power, fossil fuels as a proportion of Britain's energy mix were higher than at the start, even though we knew everything about climate change, including not the non-linearities, including the feedbacks, the tipping points. We knew all of that back in 1997. And so I'm not making a party political point. Labour is almost as much up to its ears in the oil industry and the market ideology that I've been talking about as the Tories. But governments can do this if they have the willpower, but they don't have the willpower, and that's why we need to build movements.
Can I just briefly react to this? Because to some extent I agree with you. To the other extent I object to what you said. So I agree. So to the extent I agree, let me give you an example, basically, of how preferences work. And this is actually one of the main issues of traditional approaches in economics, which often assume preferences are stable and fixed and given. But no, they are not. So in the late 1990s, when I was at school, when I went to school and was a bit more politically active than I'm these days, there was an initiative in many countries in Europe to say we need to make petrol specifically and diesel more expensive by increasing the fuel duty tax in order to reduce consumption. Had this been done, and quite, I'm German, that's why I make all these German examples. So in Germany, there was a green social democrat government, and the Greens said, yeah, our program is, we want to increase petrol prices to what today would be £5 by the end of, what was it, 2005 or 2002. So they said this, and they had to pull it back, basically. They had to take it away because they couldn't do it, basically. There was no political support for it, despite being in government. But had they done it, and had more countries done it, then today we would see at least 20 or 30% less CO2 emissions in traffic. And people would not think that basically no one would think I need to have a big 4x4. I don't need to have a big 2.5 ton vehicle to travel around. A car the size what used to be a Golf is fine for a family. And at the time it used to be fine for a family to drive in this car. But because this never happened, and essentially the fuel excise duty never increased for decades pretty much. A lot of the technological innovation which went into making combustion engines more efficient was compensating by making cars more powerful and making them bigger. And people started wanting more powerful cars because everyone else was driving more powerful cars. And people wanted to drive bigger cars because they were surrounded by bigger cars. And you don't want to be in a little Fiat Punto if there's a big 3-ton SUV right up your back on the motorway. So basically, preferences have evolved, and they have evolved in the wrong direction because there wasn't the right policy intervention at the time. And now we're at the point where people would consider it to be, an egregious reduction in their welfare if they have to go back to a small Golf-sized vehicle instead of driving a big 4x4. So yeah, to this extent, I agree. Preferences are not stable, and preferences change. And the problem which of course creates the other problem now is that people are going to feel less well off if they can't go on a holiday with EasyJet every year. Because what happened with these cheap flights is that it made holidays more accessible to poorer sections in the economy. And now basically it has become the standard. And now suggesting any policies which will make it impossible for people to go on a holiday every year will be perceived as a major reduction in their well-being and in their happiness. So yeah, I agree basically that by not acting early and not acting forcefully enough, we've made the problem worse.
Thanks, Sven. Emily's hand is up. Emily, would you like to, I know we're running out of time, or we have in fact run out of time, but Emily, if you could put forward your question, that would be great.
Thank you, and thanks for coming. I guess my question is, how much of understanding the economy and economics as a whole is needed to then be able to sort of influence on a political level? So it seems like a lot of this is not down to the public to make any of these decisions. Or do you have an idea of how educating economy into the public is a way that we could fast track change on a political level? If that makes sense, the question.
I need to think about this for a bit. So if I take Gareth's position on board, then of course, economics has probably held us back a bit. But then on the other hand, understanding how the economy is going to react to certain types of intervention is important. Unless you have some ability of forcing change on people. But since we live in a democracy, and I suppose we all agree that we should live in a democracy, any intervention, anything we're going to do is going to affect people in a profound way. And if we want to prevent climate catastrophe, we probably will need to take much more forceful steps than have been taken so far. And then we need to be aware what the consequences are going to be, because if we want to do these changes, we will require the support from a wide range of the population. And if we are unaware how they are going to be affected by it and how we most efficiently can counteract these negative consequences, then we won't be able to make any change. So I don't really have an answer, I guess.
Just on Emily's question, I'll then say a little bit. Yeah, I mean, of course, we should be keen to educate everyone, and everybody should be educating themselves on economics in general. I mean, I've been putting a position for what you might call critical political economy, and slightly provocatively and polemically sort of elbowing economics as a discipline, suggesting that I see it as part of the problem because it's ideologically committed in a subtle disciplinary sense to the form of economic system that has driven us to this perilous position that we are in. And we need to develop a form of economic understanding, in my view, which enables us at one and the same time to understand the real world processes that Sven has been talking about, and critically interpret them and develop ideas for moving towards I think we have to move towards a completely different form of economic structure, one that doesn't commit, as I mentioned in my talk in the introduction, doesn't commit every owner of property to devote his or her lives to expanding the capital at their command. It's the world economy is geared around the principle of capital accumulation, and this is structurally embedded in the world economic system, which commits everyone who owns property to expand. And that is essentially the heart of that's the pulse of the world economy, and has been since the 19th, 18th, and in some parts even before then, centuries. And so that would be my response to you, that it would be a terrible elitism to suggest to people that you cannot meaningfully engage in these debates if you do not have your economics degree or your A-level economics or whatever. And that would be complete nonsense, untrue, and elitist. But yes, at the same time, it can be useful to educate ourselves on this, and hopefully, those of you who do some economics or political economy at Brunel are gaining, developing your views on this. I did want to say something just very briefly on Pippa's comment as well, which reminds us, which I would say is another reminder that we should approach every economic issue in political ways, because look what's happened here. The Energy Charter Treaty, it's a secretive corporate court, as Pippa writes, which is just designed to allow fossil fuel companies to walk all over governments and stop the decarbonisation agenda. This is an example of the capture of states by corporate interests, and the embedding of that capture in Hayekian form into the international legal system. And it is absolutely pernicious, but it is being challenged. I mean, the Energy Charter Treaty, this absolutely appalling piece of legislation which has seen fossil fuel companies minting it, and nation states forced to pay out, and it intimidates nation states. It stops them taking decarbonisation action. Even democracies. I mean, we live to some extent in a democracy, and yet when corporations force nation states to overturn, to block them from engaging in decarbonisation, energy transitions, how democratic is that? I mean, that's a reminder that it's a very partial democracy in which we live, when money does so much of the talking, and who has the money is not determined democratically. It's determined by whether your ancestors were slave traders or not, essentially. And so that would be my take on Pippa. Oh no, but the hopeful thing about Pippa's comment is that some countries have been withdrawing. The Netherlands withdrew from the Energy Charter Treaty France withdrew. The big one, I suppose, is Germany. Sven might know this. Has Germany withdrawn from the Energy Charter Treaty? There'll be huge pressure on Germany at the moment, but I'm not sure if they have. Anyway, it can be defeated. It certainly looks likely to be defeated in Europe, which would be a huge step forward for the world.
I just want to comment two things on what you just said. So one, a comment I wanted to make earlier concerning the foundation of economics. You suggest that it compels every owner of capital to expand on it. That's a normative statement which I don't think you can really assign to economics. And what economics says is a self-interested owner of capital will try to do it. I don't think you can make the argument that it compels every owner of capital to do it.
It's a systemic thing. It's the first system the world has seen that compels every property owner to systemically expand on pain of bankruptcy and defeat in the system. There hasn't been prior to the 17th century, there was no economic order in the world for however many thousands of years. Just didn't exist in that way.
Well, but bankruptcy existed as well. It probably just did have another name.
No, not in this systemic way that we've seen since the 17th century. Not if you look at the Roman Empire, the economy of the Roman Empire, it was completely determined by the military complex, essentially. But it was the army that ran the economy. Yes, people could go bankrupt. Yes, there was money, and yes, there were local markets, but there wasn't an interconnected market system to anything like the degree that has existed since the 17th century. And that's where this element of systemic compulsion was missing in pre-modern.
I think that depends on how much detail you analyze the Roman Empire. I mean, there had been free trade going on across the world during the Roman Empire. There had been markets. The argument of economists is markets is not something you develop or construct, it's something that exists. And you can analyze many situations as an interaction of supply and demand on a market, which might or might not have certain frictions. All I'm trying to say is I'm not sure you are fair in your judgment here, but I think I wanted to make another comment.
We will need to, unfortunately, we will need to draw things to a close very shortly.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, but yes, please continue. But I'm just aware.
No,
that...
I lost my thread. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Sven.
Yeah. If I remember, I will.
Yeah. No, I'm just conscious of the time. We've run over considerably, and I know people have got other things to get to. So I guess at this point, just like to thank both of you very much for your contribution and for the questions from the people in the audience. A really, really interesting discussion. Thank you so much. And the sort of the examination of these ideas and your willingness to engage and, disagreeing and in a constructive manner, I think has been really, informative and assisting us all in making more sense of this particular situation we find ourselves in. Thank you both. And please, if anyone else wants to come to any events, there's the link in the thread earlier on. Okay. Thank you so much, and bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yes, sorry, Sven.